formula, which is CBR plus 4%. So new loans will be priced at different rates. But I think in line with the central banking charter, we believe, yes, commercial banks will increase lending over time. And of course, we think this will generally be on a risk-based method. So it's not going to be arbitrary pricing. It's not going to be a finger in the wind estimation of where a certain borrower should borrow at 10, 15, 20. It's going to be data-driven, and I think, as I said, it's going to be risk-based pricing, which is something that I think the sector has to adopt. And name lending should be done away with in the sector, but as we saw with a cap in place for the better part of the last 2.5 years, small and medium enterprises suffered quite a bit, and generally the private sector was, suffocating even further. So I think it's a welcome development that the reforms go on. Of course, there's a concern that rates will be, exorbitant again, but I don't think that will be the case. I think it's a welcome development to revive growth.
Okay, so the Monetary Policy Committee is expected to be meeting next week. Which way do you think it will go? Cutting further down the rates or maintaining? And whichever way it swings, what will be the factors behind that decision?
So the directional bias for the central bank should be an accommodative one. So we think there could be a 50 to 100 basis points cut in the first half of this year. Probably not at this meeting in our view, that's not our base case, but before the end of June, I think there could be a 50 to 100 basis points cut. The reason we don't expect a move next week at the MPC meeting is I think the committee will probably want to assess how their 50 basis point cut in November has impacted lending, and how that signal has been taken by the wider banking sector. I don't think there's any inflationary concerns on the horizon, but I suspect one document that the Central Bank Monetary Policy Committee will be watching very carefully is the budget policy statement. We've seen a draft budget policy statement released by the Ministry of Finance today. I think the final one should be ready by next month. I suspect if the central bank believes that the BPS, the budget policy statement by the National Treasury, will indicate fiscal consolidation, and they'll be committed to that, then I think monetary policy can be accommodative if they believe that fiscal policy is going to be contractionary. But fiscal policy being contractionary is probably going to be the biggest grey area for us this year.
All right. Let's talk about manufacturing. Just curious what the outlook is, because government wants to raise the manufacturing share to 15% by 2023. But of course, we know that Kenya has had frictions with its neighbors, for example, Uganda. So 2023, 15%, is that feasible?
I don't think so. I mean, obviously, it's a very ambitious target, just like a lot of the Big Four agenda that we saw. Deficiencies in the manufacturing sector are way beyond some of the regional border disputes or trade spats that we have with our neighboring countries within the COMESA. I think we continue to see that taxation policies are very arbitrary, very unpredictable. There's a lot of pressure to collect tax, obviously, because of the fiscal position. But unfortunately, we continue to see the industrial sector suffer from some of these arbitrary assessments, which eventually are not good for business and not good for the private sector. But I think over and beyond the fact that manufacturing needs good infrastructure, needs a stable power supply and good distribution. I think the Kenyan government, if it really wants to even achieve 10% GDP contribution for the manufacturing sector by 2022, they ought to think about this taxation policy that's making the business environment quite toxic, very unfriendly for manufacturers. And I think it's getting a bit of a concern, because we're concerned about the fiscal position, and it looks like the government continues to believe that it could increase taxation at the expense of what we believe is now a gradually recovering private sector. But if we continue to adopt this taxation policy, which, dare I say, is borderline intimidation, it's ultimately going to be very detrimental for the private sector, manufacturing broadly, and the wider economy as well.
And the cost of production hasn't really gone down, just to mention. Well, Gibran, thank you very much for joining us. Gibran Qureshi in studio with us. All right, let's have a look now at some of your corporate headlines. An oil giant BP has signed an agreement with Angola aimed at acquiring further oil exploration rights. The deal with the country's petroleum regulator, ANPG, defines the terms for a risk-sharing contract on offshore oil block 1815. Angola is working to reform its oil industry to halt a production slump that has dented the economy. This includes privatizing stakes of state oil company Sonangol. South Korean Hyundai Motor Company has partnered with Kia Motors Corporation to jointly invest in the manufacturing of electric vehicles. The $111 million agreement has been invested in a UK-based startup named Arrival. The startup manufactures electric vans. According to Hyundai, the partnership would also enable it to accelerate its strategy to deliver electric battery and hydrogen fuel cell solutions for the commercial vehicle market in Europe. France has agreed to delay collecting a new tax on multinational technology firms until the end of 2020. The US had threatened to impose retaliatory tariffs on $2.4 billion. France, along with several other European countries, wants to limit US technology giants' ability to avoid taxes. They argue taxes should be based on where the digital activity, browsing the page, takes place and not where firms have their headquarters. And Facebook will create 1,000 new roles in London over the course of this year. More than half of the new jobs will be technology focused, with roles in software engineering, product design and data science. This includes adding to its team tackling harmful online content. That's a look at some of your corporate headlines. You're watching Global Business. Still ahead. No end in sight for a dispute over the new West African eco-currency. And brewing giant AB InBev ramps up renewable energy use in South Africa.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
Beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Global leaders are meeting in Davos for the 2020 World Economic Forum. Their mission to set the year's agenda and ask the toughest questions, from resolving trade tensions to tackling climate change. Join us on CGTN for special coverage.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business. The decision by French-speaking countries in West Africa to rename the CFA franc as ECO has been rejected by English-speaking countries in the sub-region. The 6 states, led by Nigeria, say the move to rename the single currency was unilateral and unacceptable. CGTN's Laura Walubango explains.
Last December, 8 francophone West African countries led by the President of Côte d'Ivoire announced the retirement of French colonial currency, the CFA franc. However, just barely weeks later, a speedy launch of the region's new currency, ECO, is stoking division. The Anglophone nations, which include Nigeria, Gambia, Ghana, Liberia and Sierra Leone, along with Guinea, have described the move to rename the French-backed currency as unilateral. The countries argue ECOWAS was not involved.
It must be said that the future of the ECO currency is uncertain to an extent that the announcement that has been made is unilateral. It has fundamental principles that have not been respected, since what we have been told is a currency that should be sub-regional, that is to say, belong to the ECOWAS region. However, the announcement that has been made says that ECO currency will only belong to the UEMOA area. We are really in total uncertainty and we need clarification. That action is truly one-sided.
The agreement to rename the CFA franc as the ECO scraps obligations for the West African Economic and Monetary Union members to park 50% of their foreign reserves with the French Treasury. It also strips French representatives from any decision-making and management capacity relating to the Union. However, since the CFA franc is pegged at a fixed exchange rate to the euro, the new agreement maintains this arrangement for the ECO, a move Anglophone nations are against.
These decisions to withdraw are based on the concerns of these 6 countries, and the same concerns were shared by all the experts who gave their opinion on the question of the lack of clarity in the pegging of the ECO to the euro, but also on all the conditions related to the exchange of currency. There is also the question of the management of reserves and currencies. If you notice, the countries reluctant to the ECO are countries which operate with their own currencies, which have their own monetary logic, which are in a certain comfort and which will not want to abandon this economic comfort.
Set up in 1975, ECOWAS has a combined population of 385 million. The latest single currency ECO comes as Africa prepares for the first time to trade together through its free trade agreement. Laura Walubengo, CGTN.
Let's now get more details on this with Deji Badmas, who's live for us in Lagos. Deji, the plan was to have ECOWAS member states come up with a single currency called ECO, not rename the CFA franc ECO. So why did the Francophone member states not stick to that plan?
Well, as a matter of fact, everyone is surprised that the Francophone member states of ECOWAS now decided to blindside the Anglophone members by going ahead to make this public, to announce this plan. And basically what they've done is to rename the CFA franc, they rename it, and they're going to call their own the ECO, even though there are, well, a number of changes as pointed out in that piece before you came on to me. But the fact is that the Anglophone countries are not happy about this, and they made that very clear during their meeting last Thursday in Abuja that they're not going to accept it. And the whole thing throws a spanner into the works of this single currency, because the way things are now, that suspicion is now there, and that's why the ministers of finance and central bank governors of the Anglophone-speaking countries who met in Abuja have asked that an extraordinary meeting of the heads of states and governments of the Anglophone countries, that they should meet very, very quickly so that they can take a decision. But obviously, this has certainly not gone down well, and it definitely beats everyone's imagination why, for instance, President Ouattara of Côte d'Ivoire would lead these Francophone countries now to take this decision. And somehow fingers have been pointed at France, especially at President Macron, that he basically imposed this on the French-speaking countries. And there's also that accusation that President Ouattara himself, who would be facing re-election sometime this year, and the president of Togo, that both of them are trying to make political capital out of this, because they know that you know, in their countries, especially in the Francophone countries now, that the CFA franc is not popular. A lot of people have been campaigning to you know, to get it scrapped, and basically what they've done now is to basically use it as a gambit now to win votes for themselves when the election comes.
Okay, Deji, I'm going to allow you to put your phone on silent as I ask you the next question. What are the Anglophone member states now proposing as the next course of action?
Well, that's the funny thing. There's actually no concrete proposal on the ground. What they did was to say that they're going to hold that they're calling for an extraordinary summit of the heads of state and authority of the West African monetary zone countries. Now I'm talking about the English-speaking countries now, including Guinea, by the way. So we hope that meeting, the extraordinary meeting now, summit, will be called. And I think the concrete decision will come out of that meeting when the heads of states eventually meet. That's when we're going to get a concrete decision. But for now, if you read through what the Nigerian finance minister said, it came very clearly that what the English-speaking countries actually have against this is that, look, they suspect that there's French involvement in this, and that the kind of echo that the French-speaking countries have come up with is not independent enough. And that's the reason why she said that the announcement is not consistent with the decision taken by the heads of states of ECOWAS countries back in December, and that what they want is an independent single currency. So for them, what has been announced by President Ouattara is not independent enough. And somehow there's a point to that when you consider the fact that, yes, it's true that these French-speaking countries are now free. They are not, you know, now they may not be required to keep 50% of their reserves now with the French Central Bank. But the fact is that the decision to peg their own eco now to the euro, and considering the role that France plays in the European Union, and that whatever is done will be backed or guaranteed now by the French Central Bank, that alone sends the red light now to these English-speaking countries now that, look, what is being put on the table is not independent and is not what was agreed on back in December when the heads of states actually met and adopted the decision now to roll out the single currency this year. Okay, so of course that's the biggest issue of contention, that this new echo will be pegged to the euro. That wasn't what they'd agreed on. What was the initial plan and what were the reasons behind that plan, Deji? I think it's pretty straightforward. The reason why, for instance, the decision was taken to peg the euro to peg the echo now to the euro, basically would have to do, from my own reading of the situation, would have to do with the inputs of France. And that's the reason why some people in the region have said, look, this is basically an imposition from France. And that's the reason. And, you know, and to be candid, the English-speaking countries said they were not consulted at all. Nobody told them anything. So basically, the general impression is that, look, it's an imposition from France, and that basically this is like a renaming of the CFA franc. So this is actually not a total cutting of ties between France and these French-speaking countries now, because it's pegged to the euro. France is a big player in the European Union, and everything will still be backed or guaranteed by the French bank. You know, it's something some of these African countries do not want to see, because a decision still has to be taken, for instance, as to, in terms of the general echo now, as to where, for instance, the central bank of the echo would be cited. That decision has not been finalized. But with this now, it appears you're going to have a pooling of, well, let me just put it this way, monetary policy decisions will definitely, with the current arrangement we have now, monetary policy decisions to some extent will be taken away from these individual countries. And it's something that some of them do not want to see, especially Nigeria. And that's part of the reason why Nigeria has actually been foot dragging over this issue of the ECO. I think going forward, Peninah, it's going to be a very tough one when that extraordinary meeting is called. And I really don't know how this will be sorted out, but there's no doubt at all that what has happened, what the French-speaking countries did, has actually cast a very dark shadow now over the plan for a single currency. It's very unlikely that we're going to see that single currency this year. Because, look, let's face it, even the convergence criteria, as a matter of fact, we understand only 2 countries have actually met it. I'm talking about the 15 member countries now. So it's difficult to see how that, with what has happened now, how the single currency for the entire ECOWAS countries now can become a reality in 2020.
And that is what they had set as the deadline. Deji, thank you very much for that update. Deji Badmas live for us in Lagos. Now, many countries on the continent, including South Africa, are battling power supply constraints and the effects of intensifying climate change. ABN Bev's multi-billion-dollar move to have the brewer's African operations running off renewable energy in the next 5 years is being led by their South African subsidiary, SAB. CGTN's Angela Coppola has more on this story.
High energy users in South Africa are gradually dumping their reliance on the constrained national grid and turning to greener energy sources. Brewing giant AB InBev acquired SA Brewery's large African network in a $100 billion takeover in 2016, which operates off 440 megawatts of power. It wants to run these off renewables in the next 5 years, and it's starting in South Africa.
So we've got on-site solar already installed in several of our breweries. And something else that we're looking at and that we've already taken steps to achieve is a partnership with Eskom to tap into their renewable energy grid mix. And so we're in talks with Eskom at the moment, and we'll be bringing one of our facilities online that will be 100% renewable by the end of 2020 in partnership with Eskom through a pilot program. And we're looking at whether we can expand that to the rest of the breweries.
The brewing giant has gone a mile further by bringing in the first electric truck. It hopes to soon replace its short-distance fleet with these vehicles and drastically reduce its carbon emissions.
This truck basically has a carrying capacity of 3.5 tons as it stands with this body over here. It has 390 Newton meters of torque and a range of up to 100 kilometers, between 100 and 120 kilometers on a single charge. These vehicles are capable of handling the tough conditions in Africa. In the US, in Europe, in quite a few different countries, as well as in Japan, we have just around 150 trucks in operation.
We drive more than 120 million kilometers in our network, so it's probably just a little bit north of 60 million liters of diesel per year across the entire Africa zone and the countries that we operate that we use for our distribution vehicles. We can at least aim for a 30% reduction in those carbon emissions on those vehicles, but a lot of it will depend on how we actually charge the electric vehicles, whether we can get all of that power charged from solar at our existing plant network, as opposed to using national grids in the countries that we operate in.
It's still early days. However, laws around companies generating their own green power still have to be drafted. And SA Breweries and AB InBev will also need buy-in from government and its partners to build those charging networks to power the new trucks in a market that is yet to fully embrace electric cars. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Sandton, South Africa.
You're watching Global Business. Coming up after the break. US President Donald Trump decries what he calls climate change prophets of doom at the World Economic Forum. And decades of neglect lead to a water crisis in Brazil's Rio de Janeiro.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
look at economic data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Peninah Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed. And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives. News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference. How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Let's have a look at other stories making headlines today. The hearings in the U.S. Senate impeachment trial of President Donald Trump is underway. 100 senators are serving as jurors and will decide whether to remove Trump from office. The U.S. president is accused of abusing power by leaning on Ukraine for personal political favors. The Pentagon is looking at strategies to reduce the number of U.S. troops in West Africa, including a reported possible option to pull out all units serving there. U.S. forces have been supporting France and the G5 Sahel joint force in the fight against extremist militants. And the African Union has named the conflict in Libya as its most urgent priority this year. Arrangements are underway for its 33rd summit for heads of state and government. Ambassadors from the continent met on Tuesday at the AU headquarters in Ethiopia's capital to begin setting the agenda. That's a look at some of the day's top stories. Now, big names are attending this year's Davos gathering and have given their speeches. The founder of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, said the world is in a state of emergency and the window to act is closing. US President Donald Trump told a packed auditorium that recent trade deals with China and Mexico represent a model for the 21st century. And that's while Huawei CEO Ren Zhengfei soothed fears over technology.
The world is in a state of emergency, and the window to act is closing. We do not want to face continued political and economic disintegration. We do not want to reach the tipping point of irreversibility of climate change. And we do not want to leave behind to the next generations an ever more hostile and ever less habitable world. Just think of the wildfires in Australia. So what should we do? First, the basic concept of the World Economic Forum is that all those challenges are so great that they cannot be addressed by one government, by one business, by one organization alone. We need a global platform for collaborative action.
Today, I'm proud to declare that the United States is in the midst of an economic boom, the likes of which the world has never seen before. We've regained our stride, rediscovered our spirit, and reawakened the powerful machinery of American enterprise. Just last week alone, the United States concluded 2 extraordinary trade deals: the agreement with China and the United States, Mexico-Canada agreement, the 2 biggest trade deals ever made. They just happened to get done in the same week.
Technology explosion that causes a fear among people, whether that's good or bad, to me, I think is for the good. I believe in the face of new technologies, humanity will be able to use new technologies to benefit society instead of destroy society. Because the majority of people in society aspire for good life instead of a miserable life. Technology makes communication much easier. People have a deeper understanding about the things around them. People are getting smarter, and that pace is picking up.
Let's get more details now on the day's events from Guy Henderson in Davos. Guy, the Davos conference officially kicked off today. What were the day's highlights?
Well, you saw some of them there. Marine One, Donald Trump's, US President Donald Trump's helicopter, arrived this morning just a few hours before his impeachment trial was due to get underway in the Senate back home in the United States. There's an election campaign, of course, heating up at the moment. And so I would say we'd seen a slightly different Donald Trump here during the course of his speech, perhaps less keen to focus on the problems as he sees it with the global economic and political system, and keener to focus on his claims of how he's gone about fixing it over the course of the past 4 years, because, of course, he has to sell that record to his voters back home. Let's start with his economic record. I mean, he was talking about how he saw a solution to the world's economic imbalances at the moment being essentially the policies that his government had brought in over the last 4 years, a form of economic nationalism that he basically said had helped out normal working people. He called it a blue-collar boom. On the international front, he laid into China specifically, saying that the cause of the ultimate cause of the global trade imbalance wasn't due to American tariffs. It was due to the fact that for years China had taken advantage of the global trading system. So again, a man very much fixed on saying that it is the fact that he has slapped these tariffs on China and has now come up with a phase one trade deal as being part of the solution, far from the problem. Now, that is obviously something that particularly the Chinese government has come back on and strongly agrees with. We heard a little bit from the Chinese vice president, premier there, talking about how despite the fact that others, without naming the US, but despite the fact that others might be moving towards protectionism, China would continue to open up. So two very contrasting views of how to fix the global economic and trade system here in Davos.
All right, so sustainability is the main theme this year, and yet Trump in his speech decried climate prophets of doom, calling for a rejection of what he said were predictions of the apocalypse. What have been the reactions there to that speech?
I mean, this is another area that it sounds strange to say it, but Donald Trump was trying to frame himself as a fixer rather than a spoiler. From the moment he walked in, he was asked whether Greta Thunberg, the Swedish climate activist, was right on climate change. He slightly defected, but by saying, I love the environment. The environment's very important to me. Not particularly specifically talking about climate, but certainly saying, I'm a friend of the environment. During his speech, he talked about how the US was going to participate in planting millions of trees across the world, part of a World Economic Forum initiative here. And he branded the very people who are leading the cry at the moment to protect the planet in this growing climate crisis as socialists and pessimists, he said in his speech, despite the fact that he then went on to talk about how the United States would continue to tap its huge reserves of fossil fuel energy. So needless to say, Greta Thunberg, who'd been sitting in the audience for that speech, came back an hour or so later in her own speech to say, look, there is no one ideology that is going to be better or worse at fixing the climate crisis. You may say that people like us are pessimists, but that is only because people like you, Donald Trump, are doing very little to fix the climate crisis.
Wow. So throwing it forward, Guy, what should we expect tomorrow?
Well, a couple of different, actually many different events. This is such a huge event. All of these different country stands all the way down the main promenade, all these, varied seminars on all kinds of different topics. But just two of the sort of highlights that I picked out for you. One big side event on poverty alleviation with a China focus, and the discussion point there will be to what extent China's Belt and Road Initiative is serving as a promoter of poverty alleviation, not just in China, but throughout the world. So that is one big event coming up. The other one is going to be that the Hong Kong Chief Executive, Carrie Lam, is going to be taking part in a conversation, I believe, with Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum. That will be another key session, perhaps a few comments there on the situation in Hong Kong after so many months of protests.
All right, Guy, thank you very much for that. Guy Henderson live for us in Davos. Earlier, CGTN's Tian Wei caught up with the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab. Take a listen.
You've been traveling to China, Professor Schwab, frequently. Once or twice or even 3 times every year. You got a medal, a national honor medal coming from the Chinese president. What do you make of this country, China, which many have been observing for decades, but still there seems to be very mixed, shall I say, analysis?
Yes, maybe as a European, I see Europe working together, sometimes with difficulties, despite the diversity which we have. And I think we have to recognize that China has a long, very proud cultural traditions dating back many centuries. China is the largest country in terms of population and soon the strongest country in terms of economy. So we have to treat China with respect, sometimes with admiration, and we have to make sure that China takes a very responsible and responsive role in global affairs.
One of the things of the backdrop for this year's World Economic Forum has a lot to do with the Phase 1 deal signed between China and the United States. How do you see events like this will be making it possible for the international community to come to consensus?
It's a very important step forward, and I'm very happy that this deal was signed just before the annual meeting opens, because it provides new confidence into the future of the economy. But we still have an important step to go. And I hope that the strong presence of business leaders here, of political leaders, will help to move forward, not only related to the trade deal, but also related to many other issues which we have to face in the world of today.
To Brazil now, the water crisis in Rio de Janeiro has entered its 3rd week with no end in sight. Residents continue to complain about murky, bad-smelling tap water. Environmentalists say the problem is a consequence of decades of neglect. Lucrecia Franco has more.
It is impossible to hide that something is wrong with Rio de Janeiro's tap water. It has been like this, dirty, smelly and foul-tasting for over 2 weeks now, especially in the city's poor neighborhoods. Rio police are investigating whether human error, natural causes, or even sabotage could be responsible for the problem, after the state government said the situation was unacceptable. Rio's public water utility, SEDAI, said the water was affected by geosmin, a harmless organic compound, but consumers are not taking any chances.
We can't drink that water. I already felt bad and had a stomachache. No way.
The water is dirty, muddy, smells bad even when we shower. How can we drink it?
And the solution has been to buy bottled mineral water that is expensive and has become difficult to find. The problem starts exactly here at the Guandu treatment plant, which receives the highly polluted waters of the river of the same name and is responsible for supplying water to some 9 million Rio residents. Mario Moscatelli, a biologist and environmentalist who has been monitoring Rio's water pollution for decades, says the 3 tributaries that flow into the river bring huge amounts of chemicals and sewage sludge.
Essa situação era uma tragédia, é uma pré-tragédia.
It was a foretold tragedy. The situation has been getting worse in the last 20, 30 years, and it is a time bomb.
We cannot say for sure that this water is or will be safe, but what we do know is that the plant was built to treat water, not sewage.
To ease public fears, SEDAI, the water utility, which is among the companies included in Brazil's privatization plan, said the water supply from the Wandu River will be treated with powdered activated carbon. But it is hard to predict, environmentalists say, when and if the state of the water will go back to normal. Lucrecia Franco, CGTN, Rio de Janeiro.
In the commodities market, oil prices fell more than 1% today on expectations that a world-supplied market would be able to absorb disruptions that have cut Libya's crude production to a trickle. Almost all Libya's crude export capacity is now under force majeure, a waiver on contractual obligations, after pipeline blockades in the east and west of the country hindered oil production. If Libyan exports are halted for any sustained period, storage tanks will fill within days, and production will slow to 72,000 barrels per day. That's according to a spokesperson for state oil company NOC. Libya has been producing about 1.2 million barrels per day recently. Still ahead on Global Business. We visit an Egyptian village famous for recycling tires while creating jobs, as well as a community of artistic mud huts in Zimbabwe.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Peninah, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival, and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Egyptian dealers collect used tires from across the country to deliver them to Meit Al Haroun. That's a village fast becoming famous for its recycling tire work. The workshops boost environmental protection while creating much-needed employment. CGTN's Alexandria Majala has more.
In Meit Al Haroun, a village in Egypt, residents have for decades eked out a living by recycling old tires into baskets, landscaping materials, and alternative fuels. From early morning, workers covered in soot and dust can be seen sharpening their knives to cut huge tires stockpiled on the village's roadsides.
We get used to car tires that are dumped in the rubbish bins. Some dealers bring them to us and we cut them in half. Then my colleagues split the inner layers using a winch, shaping them into rubber baskets.
The heavy-duty baskets are often used by farmers, gardeners, and laborers. This small Nile Delta village, 70 kilometers north of Cairo, has gained a reputation as Egypt's top rubber recycling hub. Dealers collect used tires from across the country, delivering them to Met Al Haroun in huge trucks. Prices per tire go up to around $4. The handful of workers in the workshop process up to 10 tires per day, producing between 80 to 120 baskets. Although his business is successful in going from strength to strength, there are hurdles.
Most of the workers here suffer from carpal tunnel syndrome, since our entire work depends on working with our hands. So most of the workers have problems with their nerves on their hands. That's why they do the surgery, which relieves the worker from pain for a while before it returns again.
The tires don't always end up being repurposed. They often end up chopped into small pieces to be used by cement factories as an energy source, an alternative to low-grade mazout fuel oil, while other parts are recycled into mulch for playgrounds. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
Deep in the valleys of the picturesque Matopos Hills in the southwest of Zimbabwe is a community that's keeping an age-old practice alive. Brightly painted houses are a common sight in the region, but they're not just colorful, they also carry a deeper meaning.
The views are breathtaking, but this rugged terrain has delayed the delivery of telecommunications and electricity here. It may be cut off from all those modern conveniences, but this area remains deeply rooted and connected to its history, culture, and heritage. Mud hut walls are the canvas for ornate paintings. Local women produce these each year using different color soils and charcoal.
We paint after the harvest when we have spare time and do not have to go into the fields. It's a way meant to beautify our homes.
Beyond aesthetics, the decorations which are carried through inside the houses are evocative of the history of the Ndebele people who settled here after migrating from Masvingo, home of the great Zimbabwe ruins. The prominently featured circle carries a significant meaning.
When you look at the stars, including the sun, the moon, all of them are secular and they are in constant motion. And if you look at those parts that they follow, their orbits, they are secular or elliptical. So everything about the universe seems to be built around the circle. Right, so that circle, and you look at Africa in terms of their architecture, their cattle crawls, everything about them is secular.
It symbolizes the balance between man and nature, a relationship being put to the test by modernization that is manifesting itself here through the replacement of clay and thatch with brick and mortar. Traditionalists want to see the practice adapted.
So you can modernize without having to use clay, without having to use grass. Use current material. If you are using fiberglass, if you are using glass, you can use it and produce these things.
The rain has washed away some of the artwork, but a fresh coat of paint in a few months will renew its splendor, helping to keep a tradition that's been passed down for generations alive.
My mother taught me how to paint. I have also taught my daughters how to do so that they can continue with this tradition long after I am gone.
Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Matobo District, Zimbabwe.
And a look at the currencies now. South Africa's rand dipped to a new 5-week low today, with the currency struggling for momentum as a weak domestic economic outlook fails to provide a basis for optimism. The currency has weakened more than 3% versus the greenback since the start of the year. South Africa's economy is growing at a snail's pace, with power supply interruptions from struggling state utility Eskom contributing to low business confidence. And with that, we come to the end of Global Business tonight. We'd love to hear from you. Send your feedback to the contacts on the screen and follow us on our digital media platforms. I'm Peninah Karibe. Thanks for watching.